Lovely. Thank you all. As you know, we've been talking about Sabbath and what Sabbath keeping really means. And last week I talked about keeping different crops and fields and leaving things for the poor to eat out of fields and letting things go. Remember the fists that you make and how you hold on to things. And then Sabbath keeping means letting it go, dropping it. And the assignment this week was to let things go. To keep the Sabbath means drop it and relax your fists. How did that go for you this week? Letting things go and just dropping what you are holding on to so tightly. That's part of Sabbath keeping, the 10 Commandments. So this week we're going to explore a different aspect of Sabbath keeping. And our text today is from Exodus 20, and it is actually part of the 10 Commandments. The traditional word is from that. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in the 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but God rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. When I was a child, I read all the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. How many of you read her books? All right. In her book, Little House in the Big Woods, she writes about how as a kid she absolutely hated Sundays. For Laura, a child of pioneers growing up in the 1860s, Sunday was the longest and most unbearable day of the week. On Sundays, she had to wear the nicest clothes she had all day long, and she could not make any noise. She could not run around or play, and she had to sit perfectly still, silently looking at pictures in her books or quietly listening as her parents read stories from the Bible. And she wrote in her book that Sundays were agonizing. She wrote, Sundays at my house, and then I'm going to insert here, Sundays at my house in the 1960s and 70s were actually not much different than Laura. I wasn't allowed to patron any stores or go out with friends, and Sunday school and church were required. Sometimes Sunday church happened once in the morning and once in the evening. Now, going back to Laura, one particular Sunday she wrote that she could not sit still anymore and she couldn't be quiet any longer, and so she started to play with her dog. Pretty soon she started running and shouting, and her dad told her to stop, and she started to cry. She told him she hated Sundays. And her dad told her that as long and as hard as Sabbaths were to her, they were not nearly as bad as they were for her granddad. And then I'm going to quote, "When your grandpa was a boy," Laura's father said, "Sunday did not begin on Sunday morning as it does now. It began on sundown on Saturday night. Then everybody stopped every kind of work or play. Supper was solemn, and after supper, Grandpa's father read aloud from a chapter of the Bible while everyone sat straight and still in his chair. Then they all knelt down, and his father said a very long prayer. When he said, 'Amen,' they got up from their knees, and each one took a candle and went to bed. They must go straight to bed with no playing, laughing, or even talking. Sunday morning, they ate a cold breakfast because nothing could be cooked on Sunday. They dressed in their best clothes and walked to church. They walked because hitching up horses was work, and no work could be done on a Sunday. They walked slowly and solemnly, looking straight ahead. They could not joke or laugh or even smile. And in church, Grandpa and his brothers had to sit perfectly still for 2 long hours and listen to the sermon. They dared not fidget on the hard bench, and they could not even swing their feet. They dared not turn their heads to look at the windows or the walls or the ceiling of the church. They had to sit perfectly motionless and never for one instant take their eyes from the preacher. That would be terrible. When the church was over, they walked slowly home. They might talk on the way, but they must not talk loudly, and they must never laugh or even smile. At home, they ate a cold dinner which had been cooked the day before. Then all long afternoon, they must sit in a row on a bench and study their catechism until at last the sun went down and the day was over. That's the end of the quote from her book. Later in the book, Laura's father tells another story about when her grandfather was a little boy and he got caught sledding with his brothers on a Sunday. And in that story, her grandfather's father waited until sundown, till after the Sabbath was over officially, to take the little boys out to the woodshed to tan their jackets. Can you imagine how hard it would have been to wait till sundown to get your punishment because you had sledded? Oh my. Well, now that I'm a theologian, I can sort of shake my head and wonder about how human beings have made something so complex and legalized about what God actually intended as freeing and beautiful. We do that as humans, don't we? Can you all hear? Something changed with my microphone. Okay, now it's back. Okay, there are 2 foundational Sabbath stories in the Bible that are associated with creation. The first is that God creates the world in 6 days. Now, we don't need to get hung up about the science of that story or how long a day is, because it's a story that is told for a purpose other than science. But on the 7th day, God rested. And the point is that creation and Sabbath are intimately connected. The second story is the story of Israel's exodus from Egypt and slavery as they crossed the sea. And the point of that story is that Sabbath and escape from slavery are intimately connected. In the creation story excerpt that I read earlier, the theme is that we are universally blessed by God, and because of that, we have Sabbath joy. God sees, as Paul told the children, that everything in creation is good. And because everything in the creation is good, God can rest. In fact, by God's own precedent, rest is woven into the fabric of the universe. So, have you ever had a very tiring, exhausting, hot day when you could not wait to crawl into your own comfortable, cool, relaxing bed? You know that exhilarating feeling of cool sheets, the stability of your own mattress, your pillow, the love of your spouse or your pet, the comfort of familiar smells, sights, and sounds that are around you. Do it with me. It's the very best pleasure to know that peace and joy, right? It's better than vacation to come home to your own bed. That's what Sabbath is to be about. To just rest in your own bed. It's that release from power and control, absolute relaxation. It's the periodic self-limitation. It's where creation climaxes and finally it coheres. Everything stops and you can rest completely. It's the glue that holds the world together. And according to Dr. Rick Lowry, who wrote the text that Paul and I are basing this sermon series on, it is a delightful twist because in the creation story, rest is a verb in this passage of Scripture, and work is a noun. So Sabbath rest is actually active, not passive. Furthermore, he says, its meaning is in reference to God's creative work, and Sabbath is not actually the absence of work, it's work's fulfillment. It celebrates creative labor. So rather than saying no to work, Sabbath says, enough for now. Enough for now. So working people might be expected to welcome a mandate day of rest. The self-restraint of Sabbath observance, however, causes us a leap of faith, a firm confidence that the world is going to continue to operate for a day without our labor. Isn't that a wonderful thing? You know, we all get caught up in the idea that the world won't really go on without us. Any of you guilty of that? I won't ask you to raise your hands. But God is willing and able to provide enough without our help. This might be news to some of you, but God is able and willing to provide enough for the good life without our help. So Sabbath promises that 7 days of prosperity will happen with only 6 days of our help. And it operates on the assumption that human life and prosperity actually exceed human productivity. We get more out of life than what we put in. Isn't that wonderful news? We can put in 6 days and get out 7. Now that's a spiritual promise that God has built into the creation. We get more out of life than we put in. I think that's especially difficult and a spiritual concept that's hard for American citizens to grasp. I really think so, because America is built on hard work and effort. That life is more than human effort. The abundance of God's provision is what makes Sabbath a spiritual principle, and it's about God's providential care. When we rest peacefully on the Sabbath, it's because of what God has created and provided, not what we have done. It's a matter of what God has created and what we believe. God set it up from the beginning of creation to be this way. So that's the first principle of Sabbath. It's always connected to creation. The second principle of Sabbath is that it's bound to the story of Israel's exodus from Egypt and slavery. So you remember the story. When Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, they crossed the sea and they were in the desert. God provided manna, the bread from heaven, and water for them. but it came with explicit instruction, right? Each day there was going to be enough bread from heaven for each person, but the people weren't together more than they could eat that day. Except one day a week, there would be extra bread that would last twice as long so that the people wouldn't have to gather it on the Sabbath. And the final instruction was that the bread from heaven could not be hoarded up. Each person was to gather just what they needed. And the text was quite specific. Life's goods exist in finite, limited quantity. Not scarce, but limited. God's blessings are generous, lavish, and abundance is provided for each and every person. But the surplus is limited by human need. So if people hoard, then there's not enough for everyone. So the question is, what can we learn in the modern day from these Hebrew Bible principles? Are you ready? I can tell you're really excited. What can we learn from these Hebrew Bible principles? Okay, first, God provided the world out of chaos and created this and made the creation to be orderly. In that order, God created a world where holy rest is important. So are you ready for a nap this afternoon? Yes. And we rest not so much because we're tired, but because that's part of what we're supposed to do. We rest on Sabbath days to remind us that our place is in a created world where we don't have to work all the time. We rest to remind us that labor is not the end-all, be-all, that we're not so self-important that we have to work all the time. And we rest to remember that the world is God's, not ours. We rest to put our efforts in perspective. We rest to remember that all things belong to God, not to us. And this rest puts us at peace with ourselves and with creation. So resting doesn't have to mean taking a nap. It can mean taking a walk in the creation. It can mean going to Botanica or the Arboretum. It can mean resting by playing games with your family or doing something really special. But it means not laboring. When we observe the Sabbath, we remember that the Exodus has provision of bread from heaven. And Sabbath is a critique of the status quo and a call for a better world where everyone has enough. So observing the Sabbath actually means making sure everybody has enough. Making sure everyone has enough. So it might mean Sabbath rest means baking bread and delivering it to a place where people are in need. Sabbath, another thing we can learn, is an active word. It's a noun. It's a time to ensure this equity and this shalom for our brothers and sisters. It may mean, when we observe Sabbath, that we offer peace or food or security or shelter to someone so that we can be a part of God's restoration of equality in the world. So it doesn't always mean taking a nap. It can mean being a part of that equality, writing our legislators to make sure that there is enough for everyone. And finally, we can learn that Sabbath is a weekly celebration anticipating a more just and humane world. So that's what Sabbath keeping is all about. Are you excited for either a nap or an action this afternoon? An active part in a just world. That's what Sabbath keeping is all about. You ready? You can do either or. All right. We have added back in some singing since we are ready to leave. So the choral benediction is on the back of your bulletin. It is "Go in peace." You're invited to stand. And as we sing our choral benediction, you're invited, if you wish, to place an offering in the foyer in the offering plates. And then we're going outside for visiting so that we can be safe as we visit and have fellowship time. So we'll stand and sing "Go in Peace" 2 times, leave offering, go outside in the courtyard to visit and welcome our guests. And we don't have coffee, but next week we'll have some refreshments for our fellowship time. Please stand.